So let's begin. We'll begin with a brief introduction. The Renaissance period, which spanned from 14th till 17th century, marked a flourishing of poetry in Europe, particularly in England. So there was flourishing of poetry. Poetry was becoming prevalent. It was growing, right? Then Renaissance, but the unique characteristics of the Renaissance poets and the poetry was that the poets of Renaissance broke away from the constrained medieval traditions and writing styles. The writing styles, the kind of traditions that were being followed during the medieval period, was done away with. The poets of the Renaissance period started to use different kinds of styles. They drew inspiration from classical Greek and Roman poets. As you all know, that the Renaissance period is all about embracing the old tradition of Greek and Roman people. So in poetry as well, they drew inspiration from classical Greek and Roman poets, in which they embraced humanism and individualism. So now, what is humanism? Humanism is in Renaissance period. During the Renaissance periods, the concept of humanism means the emphasis on human potential, human reason, and individualism. Drawing, and these ideas were drawn from the uh, classical text, right? So there was a lot of focus on the individual. Say, as you see, it's written embracing humanism as well as individualism. These terms can be used in a similar way. Individualism emphasized the importance of the individual's unique talents, individual unique abilities and achievements. It fostered a sense of individual. Earlier there was this sense of community, a very strong sense of community. The community was very close knitted, and people would follow a similar kind of rules, conventions, right? So but during Renaissance, people started to feel that there should be something called an individual, right? And it fostered a sense of personal identity. This idea of personal identity started from the Renaissance period. Autonomy and then creativity, all of these things. I hope you got a gist of what the Renaissance poetry actually comprises of. All right. Uh, Now we're going to go mm, move forward with the key characteristics of Renaissance poetry. All right. So, what are the key characteristics of Renaissance poetry? First of all, the use of sonnets and other new poetic forms like the metaphysical conceit. What is a sonnet? First of all, you have to understand what is a sonnet and what is metaphysical conceit. These were new poetic forms that were being used during Renaissance. It was not there during the medieval times. So, what is a sonnet? Sonnets are poetic forms consisting of 11 lines, and it is traditionally written in iambic pentameter, and they often explore the themes of love, themes of beauty, time, mortality. These kind of themes were being explored in a sonnet, and they also started using metaphysical conceit. Metaphysical conceit were used by the metaphysical poets. We'll discuss about it later. So what is metaphysical conceit? Metaphysical conceit employs or uses elaborate comparisons, paradoxes, to explore very complex and very difficult themes. If you want to explore a difficult theme, you would want to compare it to something which is unrelated to it, right? Like that is called the use of metaphysical conceits, which was being used by the metaphysical poets. We'll discuss about it later. But as of now you have to understand that it is a poetic device that started to being used during the Renaissance period. And there was a lot of emphasis on human emotions, love, and the natural world in the Renaissance poetries. Elaborate imagery and metaphors, like very large scale imagery and metaphors were being used on large scale. Focus on ideals of beauty and perfection, these human qualities, all these things started to be explored during Renaissance in Renaissance poetry. Notable Renaissance poets, important Renaissance poets include Petrarch, William Shakespeare, John Donne, Edmund Spenser, and others who produced works celebrated for their artistic expression and explorations of human nature and experience. So they explored various themes related to human nature and human experience, right? Even though William Shakespeare is known for being a great dramatist, playwright, he also wrote poems, right? And he is very famous for his sonnets. Mm. And overall, Renaissance poetry ushered in a new era of poetic expression, individualism, a revived appreciation for classical themes and forms. Next is continuity with medieval values. The Renaissance poetry did not entirely break from medieval history in values. Sure, it did break away from the traditional styles, the writing techniques and styles. There were lots of innovation in those things, but there were traces of medieval history and values still in Renaissance poetry. That you have to keep in mind. Sir Philip Sidney epitomized the ideal Renaissance gentleman. The ideal Renaissance gentleman means the perfect Renaissance gentleman. How should a Renaissance gentleman, perfect gentleman should look like? That was epitomized or was being shown in the most perfect example by this poet, Sir Philip Sidney. So this Renaissance gentleman, this knight, was expected to have these masculine virtues like bravery, chivalry, passion, and scholarship, right? So these were the qualities expected from a Renaissance perfect gentleman. These were knights who were being represented in many of the Renaissance literature, right? And then influence of Petrarch. Petrarch is a very important figure, right? Petrarch was an Italian poet, and he was the one who influenced the creation of this poetic form called sonnets. And inspired from him, Shakespeare created his own sonnet form, which is now known as Shakespearean sonnet. So Petrarch used to idealize his beloved, and most of his writings, the sonnets, the poems that he would write, was addressed to his love, to his beloved, called Laura. And he used to idealize, or write perfectly, like write all the good things about his beloved in his writings, in his poems, right? So these poems addressed to his beloved Laura were these poems influenced early Renaissance verses. Early 16th century poetry, the early Renaissance poetry, featured classical and Italian Renaissance references alongside contemporary concerns. Obviously, the Renaissance poets would write themes on themes related to the contemporary concerns, but they also have used to give references of Italian Renaissance, which is mainly the Petrarch is the main figure in the Italian Renaissance, right? And featured classical and Italian Renaissance references in the early Renaissance poetry. Uh, Wit and Surrey introduced Petrarchan sonnets to English literature in Total's Miscellany in 1557, replacing scale tonics with formal courtly poetry. So here we have two very important figures of the Renaissance poetry. These are Wit and Surrey. Wit, who is also known as the Sir Thomas Wit, and Surrey is the Earl of Surrey, whose real name is Henry Howard. So these two people were very famous poets during the Tudor period, Tudor dynasty, and they were known for their contributions to English Renaissance poetry. Thomas Wit is credited with introducing the sonnet form to English literature, while the Earl of Surrey, or Henry Howard, developed the English sonnet further by introducing the rhyming scheme used by Shakespeare. He is the one who introduced the rhyming scheme that later on was used by Shakespeare on a very large scale, right? And it became Shakespearean sonnet that way. Their works help shape the landscape of English poetry during their time and even beyond that. Right, so these people are very important. And what now? I just want to tell you a bit about Petrarchan sonnet. These terms are very important. You have to keep in mind. Petrarchan sonnet. What are the characteristic features of it? It is also known as an Italian sonnet. It is a poetic form that follows a specific structure and rhyme scheme. What are the specific structure? It consists of 14 lines that are divided into two parts, and these two parts are called octave and sestet, right? Octave means the first 8 lines, and sestet means the remaining 6 lines. In total 14 lines, right? The octave and sestet are divided, like they are categorized. The octave usually what it does is it presents a theme, it presents an idea or a situation, while the sestet, or the final 6 line, provides a resolution, commentary, or conclusion. These last 6 lines are a sort of conclusion to the earlier 8 lines. All right, so this is the structure of a Petrarchan sonnet. Now we have used the other term called scale-tonics. So what is scale-tonics? Wit and Surrey introduced Petrarchan sonnets in English literature, and it replaced scale-tonics. Replaced means it was being, scale-tonics was done away with, and in its place, Petrarchan sonnets started to be used. So what is scale-tonics? Scale-tonics is also a type of verse or poem which was characterized by short, irregular lines. Short lines, very irregular lines with rapid and lively rhythm. It was popularized by the poet John Skelton. That is the reason why it is called scale-tonics. And it was often mostly used for satire and humor, okay, to show humor due to its playful and spontaneous nature, because the characteristic of this poetic form is very active, agile, and very lively. That is why it was very useful to show, to present humor. While influential in its time, it declined as more structured poetic forms became prevalent during the Renaissance. See, very structured poetic forms like some Petrarchan sonnets, and then further on Shakespearean sonnets. These kind of structured poetic forms started to come, because of which poetic forms like scale-tonics became less relevant. They were not being used that much. Themes of love, loss, solitude, change dominated poetry, and there was a focus on transience. So these were the themes that was used, that were being explored in the Renaissance poetry, in Renaissance sonnets specifically, right? Themes of love, loss, solitude, change, and transience means the temporariness of things. Ambition in Elizabethan poets. Elizabethan poets aspired to establish a new literature. They wanted the Elizabethan poets wanted to create a new literature of their own. It was very evident. It was the proof of it is in Edmund Spenser's monumental work, The Faerie Queene. Faerie Queene is a very important work by Edmund Spenser. You have to keep this in mind. Spenser drew inspiration from Chaucer, and now his inspiration were Geoffrey Chaucer and Sir Thomas Malory, combining English myth with political allegory and praise of Elizabeth I. So this poem, this work, The Faerie Queene, was mostly about the Queen Elizabeth I of England during that time. Right. So this also had a combination, a mixture of myth with political allegory. So obviously, Elizabeth I is a political figure. So there was a lot of politics in it. Sir Thomas, I'll tell you a bit about Thomas Malory. Sir Thomas Malory was a 15th century English writer known for Le Morte d'Arthur. Le Morte d'Arthur is a collection of stories about King Arthur and his knights. It's one of the most important works in English Arthurian literature, telling the tale of Arthur's reign, the adventures of the Knights of the Round Table, and Camelot's downfall. So, Sir Thomas Malory is very famous for this work called Le Morte d'Arthur. Let us now discuss The Faerie Queene, this epic work. Spenser's Faerie Queene is a highly symbolic, elusive, and episodic work. Highly symbolic, which means that the characters in Spenser's work symbolized various virtues and vices, and it was elusive and episodic in episodes. So, the Faerie Queene dealt mostly about the Elizabeth I of that time, right? It is an epic poem written in the late 16th century, and here are the main important features of this work. First, epic structure. The Faerie Queene was modeled after the great classical epics like Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. These are classical epics, and Faerie Queene was modeled after it. Right? It imitates, it has tried to imitate the classical epics. The poem has 6 books. So this Faerie Queene is written in 6 books, with each book focusing on the adventures of a specific knight. Knight, I already described you, the perfect Renaissance gentleman, right? So this poem, which is in 6 books, represented different knights, particular knights in each of the book, and each of these knights symbolized particular virtue like bravery or honesty. And then it was also allegorical. The characters and events symbolized abstract virtues, vices, or concepts. So this is the meaning of allegorical. The characters that were present in the books, in the poem, represented or symbolized certain kind of abstract ideas, or a virtue or a vice, right? For example, the Red Cross Knight is a character in one of the books of Faerie Queene, and it represents the virtue of holiness. Holiness is a virtue. So one knight in a certain book of the poem, by the name Red Cross Knight, he represents the virtue of holiness, while other characters like Una and Doza represent truth and falsehood, respectively. Una represents truth and Duisa represents falsehood, right? So these things, truth, falsehood, holiness, all these are abstract concepts, right? But the characters in this poem would represent these virtues and vices. That is why it is called allegorical. Let's move on. The themes. The poem explores various themes such as chivalry, virtue, and struggle between good and evil. The virtue of being masculine, the virtue of being brave, that is chivalry, and it also dealt about the struggle between good and evil, and ultimately the good is shown to be victorious, right? It also addresses the political themes of that time. What was the political scenario during that time, during Elizabeth I's reign? There was conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism in England. Religious loyalties. Some people inclined towards Catholicism, some towards Protestantism, and these themes were uh, present in the Fairy Queen. And the next characteristic feature of the Fairy Queen is its complex narrative, means difficult to follow through. Spenser weaves a complex narrative with multiple storylines. So you can imagine this particular poem, The Fairy Queen, is written in 6 books. You can imagine the amount of storylines and characters it comprises. It comprises, right? Each of these characters and storylines has their own quest and challenges. The poems is full of imagery, right? Symbolism and allegory. It makes it very challenging, intellectually very challenging. It's very difficult to follow through. Next is the influence. The Fairy Queen has had a profound influence, great influence on English literature. It served as the foundation for later works of fantasy and allegory. Late, later, after Spenser, there were fantasies written, and the Fairy Queen served as the foundation or a model for these later works. It is considered one of the greatest poetic achievements of the English Renaissance. Spenser's poetic innovations, like Spenserian stanza, aimed to reinvigorate the epic form of the Elizabethan age. Spenserian stanza, you must have heard about it. It is a poetic form, right? And this was invented by Spenser. The way he wrote in the kind of structure that he used in the Fairy Queen is known as Spenserian stanza, and it tried to bring alive the epic form for the Elizabethan age. As I as we already discussed, that the Renaissance poets, the Renaissance artists and writers wanted to create something of their own. Spenser was also trying to do that, right? So let us try to understand what is Spenserian stanza, what is the structure of that. It's a poetic form. It was created by, of course, Edmund Spenser in his epic poem, The Fairy Queen, and it has 9 lines. Total 9 lines, 8 lines in iambic pentameter, 8 lines in the form of iambic pentameter, and the last line, that is the 9th line, in iambic hexameter. So what is iambic pentameter? We also mentioned iambic pentameter before. Let me explain what is iambic pentameter. It's a lines of 10 syllables with every other syllable stressed. So these 8 lines that we described are in or each of these lines have 10 syllables with every other syllable stressed, which means stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed in this pattern. And then iambic hexameter, the last line of the poem, the last line of a Spenserian stanza is in iambic hexameter, which means a line of 12 syllables. Instead of 10, it has 12 syllables with every other syllable stressed. Same way, right? So the rhyme scheme typically usually follows this pattern ABA, BBC, BCC. This form allows for a flowing and elaborate structure well suited for Spenser's intricate narrative and allegorical style in The Fairy Queen. So this style, that the structure, this poetic form, Spenserian stanza used by Spenser, allowed Spenser to write the Fairy Queen in the way he wanted to, because it was really well suited to for such an intricate, such a complex narratives of the Fairy Queen. Critical reception. Spenser's work received varied interpretations. Spenser's work received different kinds of responses. Interpretation is, your own idea of what a text is, right? So some people interpreted it as celebrate English virtues, and some people criticized it for being imperialist and for the colonial administration, themes of colonial administration that was present in his work. Um, Despite debates over his role in the intellectual and emotional discourse of the era, despite all these kinds of different debates over his work and his value, Spenser's formal invention, his invention in the poetic form, and deep thematic concerns, the depth of his themes, are widely acknowledged. It is widely acclaimed, appreciated, and acknowledged. So, the summary of the work: Renaissance poetry fused or blended mixed medieval values, the values of the medieval time, with the influence of the classics and the themes of the contemporary time, which means the themes of the ongoing time, the time of the Elizabeth I. Petrarch's ideals and Petrarchan sonnet were pivotal, shaping English literature. Spenser's Fairy Queen is an example of Renaissance ambition, right? Blending allegory and epic structure. Epic structure, which was derived from the classics, and the allegory, these two together, fused together in the Fairy Queen, is an example of Renaissance ambition. Despite various reception, all kinds of responses for Spenser's work and Renaissance poetry in general, Renaissance poetry's thematic depth, the depth of the themes and formal inventions, endured as a vital part of English literary heritage. Even today, we learn, we study, we discuss Renaissance poetry because it is a part of English literary heritage. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture. I hope you have enjoyed it. We'll meet again in the next one. Till then, keep learning. Have a good day.